What do most Fortune 500 executives have in common? They learned important lessons on the fields and courts of their high school and collegiate sports teams. This is true for both men and women. Ernst & Young found that a whopping 94% of women holding a C-suite position played sports. Their wins and losses shaped their habits and who they would become. Join me on my journey to sit with some of the brightest executives in the world as we discuss how sports shaped their professional trajectory. In partnership with Chief Executive Magazine, the voice of America's CEO community, I'm your host, Don Yeager, and this is Corporate Competitor Podcast. With me for today's episode is Sean Kerins, Chief Operating Officer of Arrow Electronics. Sean's business resume includes more than 25 years of corporate international management and sales experience. But all those he gets the chance to lead today benefit because in college, Sean played basketball for one of the greatest coaches in history, Hall of Famer Jim Boeheim of Syracuse. He continued his schooling by earning a master's in business administration from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. And today, he leads that team at Arrow, which includes 20,000 employees across more than 300 locations worldwide. Their goal is to help the world's best technology companies think 5 years out, to innovate the next big thing. I am looking forward to talking hoops with the true corporate competitor.
I think the biggest thing you learn in jobs like this is that the further you go, the less you know. The more willing you are to sort of reach out and learn from others, the better off you're going to be. The business world is far too complicated these days to assume that you've seen it all and you know it all, because you frankly don't. There's a wealth of knowledge to gain from others.
Sean, thanks for joining us.
Don, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I had the chance to read a little about your background and study up on you. Saw that you grew up in New York, played basketball at Union Endicott High School, and you had a pretty impressive team, right? As a senior, you guys were 18-1. 18 wins, 1 loss. What do you remember most, the wins or the loss?
Funny enough, I was looking back through the research that you did, and I realized that unfortunately, we didn't just lose one game. We lost one more, which was ultimately the New York State AAA high school championship for all the public schools. That was in Rochester. That would come after the regular season. So when I read that, I thought, of course, the answer is it's the losses that keep you up at night for years to come. The regular season loss hurt, but the one at the very end of the season is the one that we really wanted to get. And the sad part is we had gotten to kind of the large school Final Four at the New York State level the year before, and were eliminated in the semis. So this year we got one step further and lost in the finals. To be honest, it still stings to this day, but I really enjoyed the journey.
Yeah.
I played varsity ball at UE, as we call it for short, for 3 years, and we were very successful for all 3, but that was probably our most successful team.
What was a takeaway from that kind of a year where there's obviously some magic, right? I mean, to go 18-1 in the regular season, advance as you did in the playoffs, I mean, there had to be something really special. What would be that thing?
Well, I think when you do something knowingly for the last time, you become more acutely aware of your surroundings, your relationships, the places you'll go that you may not visit again. So, there was obviously some of that in there for me. I think too, in coming out of our junior year, because we had such a good season then, but we're so disappointed to lose the way we did, we had this kind of conviction that we could go farther the next year. So there was a great sort of intensity level from the start that we had a really good thing and we were going to make the most of it. So that propelled us for the entire year, and it kind of went lightning fast. But the friendships were special. We had a lot of fun, myself and the teammates throughout that journey. When you win and you keep advancing, there's nothing like it in all of team sports, in my view.
Yeah. So Coach Charlie Terracone, did he capitalize on that energy coming off that junior year to help push you all to try to gel and do something special? I mean, how as a leader and a coach did he take advantage of, the Final Four loss as a junior?
He probably probably wasn't the greatest motivator in the world. And what I mean by that is he wasn't going to sing your praises, but he was going to set the bar high and then force you to get there, because I think he saw a whole lot of potential in us. And he was quick to remind us of, hey, good enough is not good enough. You've got to go the extra mile if we're going to get to where you really want to get. I remember him telling us at the start of the season in my senior year that he remembered all of us bawling our eyes out at the end of the prior season. And that was the way that he told us, you can ensure a different ending this year than last, but you guys are really going to have to sign up for what it takes. And we knowingly did, because we had that extra boost of energy. Charlie, who I only came to call him, after I was done playing for him, Coach T, he was, I guess you would call him old school by today's standards, but he brought to life this idea of, it's not just practice that makes perfect, it's perfect practice that makes perfect. So he was all about the fundamentals. He was all about discipline, right down to sort of the John Wooden school of, this is how you properly tie your shoelaces.
Shoes and socks.
This is what it means to run out every play, to touch every line, to grab the rim each time when we're executing various drills. He was a stickler for that stuff, because he knew you do the little things right, the big things will come. And so I learned a lot of the basics about the game from him. And he was bigger on defense than he was offense. He always believed that you play great defense, and here's how the points will come. And we were fortunate to have enough talent that we knew how to score, but we had to learn how to stop people. So he was cut right from the cloth of a Bobby Knight or an Alabalbo, if you remember that name.
I do.
Great teachers in one-on-one defense or man-to-man defense as it is. And I probably got most grounded in the game from him and his junior varsity assistant at the time, Dennis Cheer.
That's awesome. And you mentioned that he was a stickler for defensive fundamentals, but you were quite the offensive player. Not only that team's leading scorer, you actually held the school record for scoring for 3 decades. Sorry, don't mean to be dating you here, but but the idea that you would actually have that kind of offensive talent must have been a real benefit for a guy who was focused so deeply on defense.
Well, that's a great point. I obviously had the advantage of being taller than most of the bigger kids on most of the teams that we played. And we played a little bit old school in that Coach Terracone said, get the ball inside. So that benefited me, because I would have the chance to kind of make a move or take a turnaround. If you think about it, it was only 18, 19 points. So in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that much offensive production. It wasn't that prolific by today's standards, but because we played such good defense, because we didn't necessarily fast break all the time until we became seniors, the game wasn't that wide open. But I benefited from his game plan and learned to play down low, at least at that level.
Yeah.
I appreciated being a big part of the offense. That certainly was fun. And I didn't realize, you're right. I remember just a few short years ago, I got a note from a good friend back home saying, hey, your record was broken. And I said, what record? I had no idea. Coach Terracone didn't keep a lot of stats around anything but steals, charges drawn, assists, deflections, and rebounds.
Isn't that interesting? So the statistics he valued obviously played into the way he wanted to lead you and coach you. So you weren't even aware that you were the all-time leading scorer in the school.
I really was not. That's the God honest truth. In fact, the dashboard that he kept not far from the gymnasium for all the years that he was there did just that. It highlighted all those other stats, and points was absent. He would not celebrate scoring. He would celebrate all the other little things that went into the game to make the team successful.
What a powerful leadership lesson that is. Because the truth is, even though you scored a lot, my guess is you did all those other things at a pretty high level too, because that's what he as a leader identified and valued.
Right. He made sure that we understood what mattered, and what mattered was the role you played on defense, the role you played on the backboards, and the role you played sacrificing yourself every now and then to take a charge. And so he celebrated that activity. And I think that was a way of getting everybody to feel like they were part of it. Nowadays, so often teams celebrate the leading scorers, and we all know they're star players, but you celebrate all the other things, you cast a wider net.
Well, you're right. And you're celebrating those people who are invaluable without ever being most valuable. They're creating other energies for the team.
Good reference.
Yeah.
That's a good phrase.
I'll let you use it. So, so after graduation, you and one of your teammates, Sonny Spera, you head an hour north to Syracuse, where you're going to play basketball under the legend, Jim Boeheim. Tell me about that. I mean, obviously, I can understand the draw, but how does that happen?
Well, it was interesting because I was somewhat heavily recruited. Syracuse was one of the biggest name programs that was expressing some interest. It was new to me. new to my parents. I grew up in a relatively small town, if you will, even though it was one of the biggest schools in the state. We drew from a wide geographic area. So exposure wasn't a huge problem, even though this was pre-internet and then some. I tell people why Syracuse, it'd be kind of like growing up in or near Columbus, Ohio,
Right.
within 150, 200 miles of Columbus, Ohio, playing high school football. If Ohio State says, come on board, you're going to go. It's a hard thing to turn down.
Yeah.
You can pick your state, pick your powerhouse. It's a pretty hard thing to resist. And my parents valued education immensely. And so they made sure that I also knew that it would be a place I could get a great education. And I did. But once we sort of checked that box, it was really hard to resist from a playing perspective because, you want to play at the highest level you can. During that season, my senior year, I think they rose as high as number 2, if not number 1, at least for, one poll. So it was the biggest news in town.
That you were getting a chance to go there. So what's it like leaving high school and being the big dog and then going to Syracuse where you are now joining a collection of elites and you're being led by an elite? What was that transition like for you?
I can't speak to what it looks like now because some of the kids coming out of high school today are so evolved. They're so athletic, many of which, as you know, don't stay in college for even 3 years, much less 4. But having said that, it's still an adjustment. I mean, when you leave where you're the big fish in a small pond and now you are a small fish in a much bigger pond, it's an adjustment. Players are bigger, stronger, more athletic, faster, and so forth. So you got that to cope with. You're also learning to live independently, to keep up your academic schedule and do all the work to earn a good grade. Athletes today at the college level tend to more commonly use 5 or 6 years to get their degrees.
Yeah.
That wasn't something that was top of mind in the 80s. I just always assumed it was 4. In fact, years later, Coach Boeheim would say to me, you would have been an ideal redshirt because you really came into your own later in your career. And nowadays it would have been automatic. I would have been able to sort of sit one out early in my tenure and get that 5th year when I was even that much more developed. But having said that, it's a big step up. You have to sort of resign yourself that what you were good at before doesn't mean you're going to be good at this level. You got to step up your game from a work ethic, from a practice, from a hustle perspective, if you weren't already there. It's a big adjustment. Coaches knew what they were doing. There was days that you were so discouraged that you felt like you wanted to quit, and they'd been there before too, and they take you aside and let you know you're going to be fine. You just got to stick it out. But my freshman year was challenging in that way. I was fortunate in that our starting center at the time, Danny Shays, every now and then got in foul trouble. And I was sort of first man off the bench to give him some relief. So I got some really good playing time in my freshman year. And that helped most of all with my confidence level, because once you get in some big games and you make some plays and you hit some shots, then you start to feel like, okay, I can do this. And it kind of propels you to work even harder. So I was fortunate. If I look back on it, the big choice that you don't understand enough about as a young man that you appreciate later is that you're really making a choice. Do I want to go somewhere else where I can play a bigger role in a smaller pond? I was recruited by smaller D1 schools and less visible conferences. Or do I want to subject myself to the risk of maybe not playing so much, but being around some of the best college players in the game on the biggest stage? I don't think I would have chosen differently, but I'm sure I would have thought harder about it.
But you realize that you were made better by being around all those great players. That just in practice alone, you had to elevate who you were in your game just to stay on the court with them.
Oh, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So no, I wouldn't have done it differently, but I've seen many a player do that, and you'll read about great players in smaller schools, and maybe things came more automatically to them. Maybe they joined when they were already one of the top 2 or 3 players on the team. I had to work my way into the starting lineup across really 3, 4 full years before it happened.
Right.
That's a source of pride for me because it didn't, none of that came that easily out of the gate.
Coach Boeheim, after you left, right? I always love reading what coaches say about you after you leave. But a few years after you left, he actually was quoted as saying, Sean is one of the smartest players we've ever had. Obviously, he's talking about your basketball IQ, your willingness to understand and study what he's doing there. But I'm wondering, does Jim Boeheim say those kind of words to you when you're actually playing for him?
When you're 19 or 20 years old, you kind of like an attaboy now and then. He certainly would give them to you after a good game or a big play. He was not bashful in that regard, but he was also very good about I got to help these kids get better individually. I got to help the team get better overall. And of course, the Big East at the time was probably the most competitive conference in the country. And so the stakes were very high
Yeah.
and the pressure was high. And he kept the pressure on, as he should have. That's his job. What I've seen from him over the years is obviously once he has time to reflect, I think some of those insights come out later. I do remember a time or two he didn't think I was that smart on the court. And he let me know that otherwise, but I think he's appreciative of all the players and all the efforts they've made over all the years when he looks back on it, without putting words in his mouth.
Give me a great lesson learned from Jim Boeheim while watching him as a leader or as coach that has been shaping for you in the years since.
You know, there's a lot of different examples or occasions where you take something from his approach that you're applying later in life. And I think one of those for me was the fact that when you're young, you think that, well, maybe certain things are predetermined and he's going to play players that he's already made commitments to. But you quickly realize if you put yourself in his shoes, his job is to develop young men and win as many games as possible. So it's in his best interest to put the best collection of talent on the court at any given time. It's the most objective role you could ever imagine. You realize, hey, you know what? I'm going to have to earn every bit I get. The best players play. The best players make themselves visible in the way that they practice, not just in the way that they show up for games.
Yeah.
He was quick to remind us that, and you'll still hear him talk about that today, that when you see a kid play in a game on a Friday or Saturday that maybe you haven't seen play much before, it's because of what I've seen from them for the last week or two in practice.
Right.
So it gives him the confidence that this young man is ready for more playing time and let's give him a chance. The other thing that he makes clear to you is life isn't always fair. He would sort of explain why he would treat different players in different ways at different times because the circumstances were different. And as a kid, you look for this pure fairness or this pure equity, and you do realize as a grown-up that that's not reality. And he would say it. He was very transparent about it, saying, hey, life isn't always going to appear to be fair to you. And no, I'm not going to treat each and every one of you the same way each and every day all the time. And I can fully appreciate why. And that's something you don't understand as a young man, but it's something you do appreciate later in life. And especially if you have to lead others that may not always appreciate the approaches you take to their different situations.
So that's a great question. I mean, he's pulling you aside to have these conversations about what you might perceive as fair versus what he's really trying to educate you related to fairness. Have you ever done anything similar as a leader? I mean, do you see yourself having those similar kinds of conversations with some of those you've been asked to lead?
All the time. I mean, in full transparency, I'm in a pretty big role with a lot of leadership influence now at Arrow Electronics. And I look back over how my styles evolved over the years. And when I was extremely hands-on to the point where I was actually doing the job of others as opposed to making expectations clear and then holding them accountable, learning when to be involved versus learning when to delegate, learning that good teams are the combination of different skill sets, different strengths and different weaknesses, not all homogenous. When people talk about diversity in the corporate realm, they're not just talking about that or thinking about that from a humanitarian perspective. They should be thinking about that in terms of a more diverse team ultimately means a better outcome.
Right.
Now, it needs a good leader to bring together the pieces and parts in a sort of an additive way, but diversity is not just good for goodness sake, it's good for business too, is what I've come to learn. And when we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about diversity of race or gender. We're talking about diversity of educational background, diversity of geographic roots, diversity of mindset.
Thought.
Right. There's many, many vectors that comprise diversity. And the more you're able to recognize them, embrace them, and incorporate them, the better your team's going to be. And that's what I've tried to do with my journey here, especially at Arrow. And as I said, not always, successfully, but it is something that good leaders have to sort of appreciate over time. And I think that's, if I go all the way back to that experience of playing for Coach Boeheim, look, he had 12 guys plus or minus at any given season, and we had incredibly different skill sets. We played different positions. We came from different backgrounds. We thought differently. We worked differently. We spoke differently. And his job was to incorporate all that. And it wasn't a one size fits all approach. He had to put the best combination on the court that he believed would give us the best chance at any given time. So you have to learn to live with disappointment because sometimes you're not going to be one of those five guys.
Yeah.
I was fortunate. Most of the time, I was certainly in the 7 or 8. But, if you're playing at that level, it's because you want to be on the court the whole time, not part of the time.
Right. I know you played at Syracuse for 4 years. You made reference to that earlier, but in those 4 years, you had several different roles, right? You were a backup to Shays, you were starter, you team captain as a senior. As your role continued to change and the talent around you was evolving, how did you learn to adapt to a different situation almost every year? I mean, how did you develop that work habit to take that on?
For any athlete that aspires to play at some level of significance, this means a great deal to you. It's your passion. I love Syracuse University, but I'll be the first one to admit I went there first and foremost because it had a world-class basketball program. As I said before, my parents made sure I also got a good degree, and I'm glad of that too. But my point is, you want to play at the very highest level you can. You certainly want to be as good as you can. So when you don't play well, when you make mistakes, when things go poorly, when you don't step up to draw the charge, as opposed to trying to compete with someone that's much bigger than you and you're not going to block a shot, and you get pulled from the game quickly, those lessons are hard to swallow at the time. I wake up plenty of mornings the next day and you're sort of crushed by the weight of the world on your shoulders and the fact that you didn't play well and you didn't shine and you didn't get better and your coaches are down on you. And those things used to just, I wouldn't say destroy me, but they used to sort of discourage me. One of the assistant coaches early on, a guy by the name of Rick Callahan, said, the best thing you can do right now is buckle down and work even harder and have a great practice the next day. And by gosh, the absolute right conversation at the right time. And in that moment, pushing yourself to kind of purge yourself of all of that and put your best foot forward and make better plays and learn from what didn't go well. I'd walk home at the end of that, just one day later, feeling a little bit better. Like, it's going to be okay. I'll get through this. I went back and told him, you're right, Rick. This is the only cure for this sort of pain is get after it, and you'll feel better after one practice and even better after two.
Right.
In the ranks of college football and basketball, the hierarchy is such that the assistants tend to be a little closer with the players on a day-to-day and personal basis, and they're there to help pick you up and dust you off when you need it.
Yeah.
There were others. I was fortunate to have the same assistant coaches my whole time at Syracuse, not just the head coach. So there was a lot of goodness that came from that kind of continuity.
And again, what a powerful business example. The bottom line is we don't all have great days, but what do you do the next day? It's, are you ready to show up and bring your very best the next day?
You have to go back in and reapply yourself, learn from what didn't go well and what you should have done differently or how you should have led differently. You have to take that on board. If you fight through the next day or next week and you get things done again and you help others get things done in a positive way, you start to realize that you've sort of purged yourself of the demon that would otherwise keep you discouraged. So learning to cope with adversity is one of the great lessons of major college athletics. For some athletes, they're great every game and maybe they don't take that lesson home as much, but for some that are trying to learn and grow or not as good, you better be resilient or you're going to really struggle. The other part of it, Don, is every year, every season, every team is different. So as a player, you have to get better at the things that you need to get better at individually. And every year there was a go work on the following things in the off season, and that looked different for every player. Then you have to learn how to fit in. Where's the team going to need me? Where can I still help? Am I one of many competing for the same spot, or can I play a different role to get me more time elsewhere? That lesson I didn't appreciate until later. I understood the adversity piece. I understood I've got to work on my skill sets piece every year and come back as a better player for the next season. But this idea of looking at the rest of the team and assessing my competition and saying, where am I going to fit in? Because the coaches are going to need to know how to make the team better. That came later.
Yeah.
That was a reflection after I was gone. And I think some of the time I did that without knowing it. And maybe some of the time I wasn't thinking about it at all. And I would have benefited from doing so.
Yeah, no question. Your senior year, you're team captain, and different coaches use their team captains in different ways. Some use them as a sounding board. What are you hearing from the players? Others use them as an extension of their voice on the court. How did Boeheim use you as a team captain?
Well, I wasn't a guard, much less a point guard. So he wasn't viewing me as the coach on the floor in that regard, I can assure you. And I wouldn't want to put words in his mouth because I don't know how he'd think about it today. But my impression was he didn't necessarily think of this idea of team captain is somehow the extension of the coach on the floor necessarily. Remember, you're talking about on average 12 varsity athletes each year, and there's probably 7 or 8 that are going to get predictable playing time. So that's really not a lot to manage from a player engagement perspective. And I think he sort of saw it in that way. What he did expect is that you're named captain of that team because you are a role model, because you do work hard every day, because the younger players will look up to you, even if you're not the best player on the team. You'll set a standard for teamwork, for good attitude, for commitment that he wants the rest of the players to appreciate.
Right.
I think Coach appreciated this idea that you want the younger players to look up to the older players. So you sort of earn it over time, at least in those days you did. And I appreciated with him, it wasn't just about the highest scorer on the team. My senior year, that would have been Raphael Addison or even Pearl Washington. And what you want to get from a senior is maturity. You want someone who's not going to talk back to the coach, the guy in the locker room that's going to speak up on behalf of coach, who's going to say, you know what, guys, we need to get it in gear. He's right. Let's stop complaining. Let's get out and get after it. We're going to all feel better if we have a better practice or have a better game. So for him, I think it was more about being a role model, setting an example. And for me, it wasn't anything different that I suddenly did. It was just 3+ years prior of just day in, day out work ethic, commitment, extra time before practice, extra time after practice. And let me tell you something, I was not the most talented player on any of those 4 teams, but by and large, probably worked harder than most all 4 years, or tried to get the most out of what I had. And I think that's an ingredient that every team should want to have.
Now, how do you look for that ingredient of those people that may not have the greatest degree, but they've managed to show you something in their grit and determination? How are you looking for that when you're building your team at Arrow?
Well, it's different now because I'm no longer in the business of directly hiring people that are just coming out of school or applying for an entry-level position or even sort of a first-line management role. I get involved in conversations about talent at more senior levels and what do they bring to the party? What do they have to work on? What are we lacking? But at the more senior levels, track record means a lot. So when evaluating who's going to step into a certain role and are they ready or not, or can they do it or not, you have to sort of look at how have they performed over multiple quarters and multiple years. Let that tell you a story. And if you see a track record, back to if there's 3 years of dedication, then I know I'm going to get, at a minimum, I'll get a role model from Sean, and I want that for the other players. And we do a lot of the same thing in corporate life. People that bring a track record to bear, it gives you a level of trust that they're going to be fairly reliable, even if the next job is a little bit above their heads when they step into it.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So what's the best Pearl story? Give me one story.
Funny enough, it was in my senior year because Pearl was a freshman when I was a senior, and he was a great player. So guess what? He started right from the get-go and played a whole lot of minutes. No surprise at all. Super Bowl Saturday in 1984, which I'm guessing was at some point in January, late January, we hosted Boston College at home. Great game. The Carrier Dome seats up to 30,000 plus for basketball games. I think this one was at least 25 and counting. Went right down to the wire. I don't remember all the puts and takes. I do remember this, though. Close to the end of the game, we were up 2. I missed the front end of a 1-and-1. This is before the 3-point line. So even making just that shot alone probably would have iced it as long as we didn't foul them on the subsequent possession. Making 2 would have made it, out of reach. Of course, I missed the front end. Just kicking myself as I run down the floor. Wouldn't you know, Boston College comes down, scores, and won. So now they've tied the game, and they're at the foul line with probably 5 seconds or less to win it. As fate would have it, I was under the basket, and their forward at the time, who was taking the free throw, was a good free throw shooter, so you didn't expect he did miss or would miss, and he did. I grabbed the rebound, maybe took 1, maybe 2 dribbles at most, looked for the outlet pass, which was, guess who, Pearl Washington. He takes a dribble, no more than 2, and at half court, hits the shot to win it. Otherwise, we're going into overtime, which I was greatly relieved about. But I told Dwayne that he had given me the reprieve of a lifetime, and I was forever grateful. But let me tell you, the place shook that night, not just then, but for hours later and for years and years to come. So it's one of the great stories in Syracuse basketball history. And I'm the answer to the trivia question, who got the assist?
Or who missed the free throw that made the shot all the more important. That's okay. We won't.
Yeah, that part of it we don't want to tell.
We'll stick with the assist. That's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, that was one of the many fun moments we had during that wonderful season.
He was always one of my favorite interviews.
Uh,
It's so much fun.
Dwayne was, God rest his soul, just an incredible,
Yep.
incredible teammate. It was, we were all blessed to even have, in my case, just that one season with him. It was fantastic.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about some of your coaches, right? Coach Boeheim, your high school coach, some of those. I'd love to know who coaches you in business. I mean, you've got an enormous role and an important role, but it gets harder the further it seems you get toward the top to find others you can lean into and learn from. Who are you leaning into today?
Great question. My current CEO, Mike Long, has been a real great mentor because he sees the whole portfolio. He knows the whole team. He's got a better view of strengths and weaknesses. And you need to think down the road about where and how talent is going to be important and where and how gaps today could become a problem elsewhere. But I certainly lean into Mike Long because of his experience. He's seen just about everything that he ever watches me encounter. And so he's able to sort of pull me back from some of it and say, guess what? Every now and then he might say, let me save you some trouble. I went down that road a few times myself, and here's what you're going to learn. So it's wonderful to have a mentor like that I can draw upon. Just the perspective of someone that's been in the chair and seen more than you've seen is one you shouldn't ignore. I'm also engaged in a couple different professional networks. There's a CEO, COO, if you will, division president roundtable in the technology sector that I spend time with at least once a quarter. They all run public and private companies in some form in the tech sector. And so we get a chance to spend at least 4 to 5 hours every quarter talking about what are you doing about managing the realities of the pandemic and working remotely versus working on premise? What are you doing about compensation as it pertains to things related to variable performance? What are you doing with diversity in the workplace? And how are you as a company coping? What initiatives are you undertaking? Every time we get together, there's any number of things that get put on the table, all in the strictest of confidence in a way that you could feel comfortable sharing what you're wrestling with, where you need help, and others have been down that road you can draw upon too. So a big part of jobs like this are sort of establishing an informal network of peers, that play similar roles in similar companies elsewhere that you can pick up the phone and rely upon when you're trying to make a bigger decision.
And let them coach you in some ways.
Yeah.
It's great. And again, like you said, if it's a peer and they understand what you're up against, that's pretty strong.
I think the biggest thing you learn in jobs like this, and it's only now becoming apparent to me, is that the further you go, the less you know. The more willing you are to sort of reach out and learn from others, the better off you're going to be. The business world is far too complicated these days to assume that you've seen it all and you know it all, because you frankly don't. There's a wealth of knowledge to gain from others. And that's probably not one I picked up necessarily when I was younger or through playing ball, but it's one I've slowly started to pick up through real life professional experience.
I love it. One of the conversations that's kind of large right now out in the business world is this concept of building better teams. And there are a lot of people who use the word teams, in my opinion, far too loosely.
Mm-hmm.
They refer to their organization or the group of people they're leading as their team, when in fact, they're really just a bunch of people working independently with the same business card, right?
Yep.
When you're thinking about teams, you've had a chance to experience them at the best levels. What are the elements that take that group of people from a collection of individuals and actually gel them together and create a team?
So I think there's a few things to be aware of here when you think about this. In most cases, unless you are starting from scratch, you do find yourself in a situation of players in role, leaders that are up and coming and slated for something. And so you don't often get a chance to start from scratch, but you should approach each new situation with a fresh set of eyes and ears. But I think good teams, first and foremost, start with good leaders. They say, what is the one thing that every leader absolutely needs to be successful? And I remember getting that question once a few years ago, and someone gave the obvious answer is he or she needs followers. That's the one thing you cannot be a great leader without, right?
Yeah.
Kind of simplifies the whole thing. So I think good teams ultimately start with a leader who makes it clear in their own way that they care about the people they're leading as much or as more as they do about what it is they can achieve in the job. And I think people need to know that you care on some level about them as people, not just them as employees. It kind of starts there. And then I think you have to sort of make sure that you're working with people who have good character, who make decisions with integrity, who are willing to put others ahead of themselves more times than not. If you can find those two things alone, you're probably off to a good start. Then, of course, experience sets in. Is it relevant? Have you been down that path before? Do you know the industry? Do you know the technology? Do you know, the route to market? But if you don't have the first two things, I think all the expertise or experience in the world isn't necessarily going to make you a great team. You got to solve for the first two. But the third point about experience is where, back to my earlier conversation, diversity on many vectors is going to matter.
Yeah. I love one of the conversations we had earlier in previous podcasts. We had a woman named Laura Gentili. She's senior executive for ESPN. And she talked about the importance of not just being a good leader and having followers, but learning as a leader how to be a good follower. That a lot of times we think we have to carve the path at all times and it's always got to be us. And that willingness or that ability to actually take guidance, even from those who might quote unquote answer to you, right?
It's the hardest part of the job, or at least
yes,
in full transparency for me, somewhat in that let leaders tell you they don't agree. Let leaders tell you they see a different path. Learn not to take that constructive feedback negatively because it's not meant to be. And if you can create that,
that's a gift.
And it's hard to do with strong leaders because you're convicted about your beliefs, the decisions you made or want to make. And sometimes you can't be afraid to let people talk you into a different way of thinking because they're in the trenches too, and they know a lot about what it is you're trying to solve for. So the good people part creates the opportunity for that very thing to happen.
Yeah.
I would love to say, well, I absolutely agree with her. I can also tell you, I don't always practice what I preach. So it's a lifelong journey to kind of get better at that.
I love it. And when we're thinking along those lines, a lot of it comes down to culture, right? It's that ability to create that openness and that ability for people to speak truth to you, even in leadership. And that's a hard place because there are a lot of folks who are scared, right? They don't want to say those things. But when we talk about culture, to me, that's what Syracuse basketball is, right? You had a chance while playing for Coach Boeheim, and it was this program that's just well defined by culture.
Yeah.
Zone defense and culture. But it's that willingness to think all the time there about the ability to be competitive at a high level, bring in the right people. Tell me about what you learned about culture as you're developing it from your experience. Say, even if you could align it with something you learned while at Syracuse.
Culture is a really difficult concept to nail down. If you asked 10 business leaders how they defined it, you'd probably get at least 10 different answers.
10 answers.
To me, culture has a lot to do with the character of the leaders and the employees that comprise the company. Their willingness to do the right thing at the right time, even when no one's looking. That in itself is a statement of culture. And the only way that you can kind of impart that is through example. I don't think you can create culture through words. You create culture through decisions and through actions and through examples. Those are the things that tend to reinforce beliefs and values. And those are the things that you hope are going to be infectious. But communication matters a lot. Historically, many companies in the industry, they grew up in a world of hierarchy and tops down leadership and command and control. And the world in the last 10 to 20 years has changed very dramatically. And so things have gotten flatter. Communication vehicles have multiplied. Ways to reach your employees, your customers, your suppliers, your external stakeholders, they've multiplied. And so you have to be much more aware of a much broader ecosystem of experience in which you reflect your culture and in which you also transmit what you would like your culture to be. And it's not an easy needle to thread, but it does start with bring people of good quality and good character into the company and make sure, if nothing else, you solve for that at least as much or even more so than when you solve for job content alone.
Yeah. And I know at Arrow, one of the things that has been a truism over the last few years is you guys have grown through several mergers and acquisitions.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, when we think about culture as you're developing and as you're working to develop it, how do you weigh culture when you're looking at a company you may in fact merge with or acquire?
We always consider it.
Yeah.
Considering culture is a little more difficult to do than in the same way you'd look at an income statement or a balance sheet.
Right.
That you can analyze and know pretty clearly what you're getting or not getting. The culture piece is a little more ambiguous, a little tougher to discern. But we usually know enough to know that when we're talking to a company that maybe didn't grow up the way we did, that we've got to give that strong consideration, because if you don't, you're just introducing risk into the portfolio. And sometimes we get that right. And on occasion, we don't get that right. And that's the inherent risk that comes with acquisition activity. Most companies never get that right all the time. We strive to make sure that we don't ignore things like people, who's staying, who's not, culture, because that's a big part of what you get when you buy another company has a whole lot to do with the people you're going to bring on board and the relationships that maintain, not just the physical assets or the IP alone.
Right. So the highly competitive nature of your company even extends into auto racing.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the decision to take the company into that competitive space and how it plays a role in your company's culture.
Well, a lot of the credit goes to our CEO, Mike Long, as I mentioned earlier. He sort of had this vision for this very diverse technology portfolio that we represent, that bringing it to life, making it human, is a big part of establishing who we are. So it starts with this idea that technology can, in fact, improve the quality of human life. So our first foray into racing had less to do about, gee, we want to be associated with the race team, and more to do with the fact that we wanted a great example of how we could put a former race car driver who had become a quadriplegic back behind the wheel of a racing car.
So,
And that was, we thought, a really great tangible example of this idea of technology improving the quality of human life. And when you think about it that way, it becomes very personal, and it gives people in the company something to feel really good about.
mhm.
Here's what you're ultimately doing. Here's what you're playing a small role in helping to create. We look for opportunities throughout many walks of life where technology can do something very similar. And I think it's a great way to think about our culture, and something I would fully expect that we'll continue to look for. I think the racing part of it also speaks to the competitive nature of Arrow and its leaders and its employees. They're great venues for big hospitality events, so we can treat our suppliers and customers well. It gives us something that everybody in the company can be proud of, especially if the Arrow car happens to place on a particular Sunday in first, second, or third, ideally first. Those sort of things help create a halo effect that I think are positive as well. But it all starts with this idea that technology at its core is ultimately about improving the quality of human life. That's the kind of noble purpose that leaders tend to bring to their portfolio.
That's so true because, again, that idea, right? That ability to create, that's something that we can all be passionate about collectively, a feel it moment, if you will, right? Where you feel why we collectively do what we do and make it human, as you said. It changes the dynamic of everything we do organizationally. Sean, it's been a treat, A, studying you, B, getting a chance to talk to you, and C, learning from you. I can't thank you enough for all the wisdom, and it's always good to share a little Jim Boeheim love. And today, I'm just grateful that you would join us and be a corporate competitor.
I'm happy to do it, Don. Enjoyed the time together. Appreciate how thorough you went about this. By the way, I was telling our head of corporate communications, John Horrigan, wow, they really did do their research. Some of this stuff I had completely forgotten. In fact, I enjoyed every bit of it, and I wish you well. Thanks again.
I admire how Sean views adversity. When a basketball game didn't go the way he would have liked, he learned the best cure was a great practice the next day. We all have bad days at the office, but remember, we do not want one bad day to turn into a bad week or a bad month. Next time you feel defeated, look for a small win and give your all in practice. If you could share one habit, one thing you've done consistently that allowed you to separate yourself from your competitors, what would it be? In my 30-year career, 2,500 of the greatest athletes, coaches, and leaders answered that question for me.
This is Don Yeager, who did that article I was telling you about.
Don, Dave Sims with Coach K. How you doing?
Hey, Don. How you doing, my man? Great, sir. How are
What they gave to me is what I'm giving to you in my online course, Journey to Greatness. Through engaging storytelling and on-demand videos, you will learn the 16 habits that will jumpstart your personal growth. I will instruct you on how to apply these winning characteristics to your life through custom workbook exercises. We are slashing the price for our podcast listeners. Lifetime access to Journey to Greatness is normally $399, But for our podcast listeners, it will be $49 with the code podcast at checkout. Click the banner on corporatecompetitorpodcast.com to enroll. Thanks for listening to the show. I would be so grateful if you left us a rating and a review. We will be rolling out a new episode every Wednesday. To be the first to listen, subscribe to the podcast on our website, corporatecompetitorpodcast.com. Plus, as a thank you gift, you will receive a free chapter from one of my best-selling books on the habits of high-performing teams. Stay in touch by connecting with me on social media at Don Yeager, Yaeger, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Until next week, I appreciate you.